being here. My name's Judy Margles. I am the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I want to welcome you to today's discussion with author Faris Cassell and her new book, The Unanswered Letter. The museum's mission is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. All of our programming, including today's event, recordings of past events, are offered free of charge. We're always grateful for any donation you might be able to make to support the museum or to join as a member if you haven't already done so. I also want to thank Amber Curson. She's the box you can't see the person. Amber is our tech person who so ably makes sure that all of our Zoom programs go as uneventful technologically as they have gone. So thank you, Amber. We offer a wide range of programs. We've got a packed schedule for the remaining weeks in March and April. All of our events can be found on our website. I urge you to check there to see what's going on. So the Unanswered Letter, the book that we're going to be talking about today, it is a remarkable work of investigative journalism. That, as you're going to hear, it revolves around a letter sent August 7th, 1939, from a man with the last name of Berger who lived in Vienna. He sent a letter to another man with the last name of Berger who lived in Los Angeles. The letter begins, and I know Ferris will read the entire letter, but the letter begins with this starkly simple sentence. You are surely informed about the situation of all Jews in Central Europe. By pure chance, I got your address. And it goes on to say, my daughter and her husband will go to America. Help us follow our children. It is our last and only hope. The letter ended up in Faris Cassell's hands. Perhaps in someone other than her capable hands, a letter like this might have elicited sadness or despair for the plight of Europe's Jews, a momentary reflection about the sheer awfulness of the Holocaust. Fortunately, the letter ended up in the hands of a superb journalist who set out to search for any of Berger's surviving family members. And what she has done is built a portrait of a family members who fled the Nazis and those who were murdered by them. Every Holocaust story has unique twists and turns, and this story has plenty. Perhaps what was so astonishing for me is how a single family story, when told as expertly as this one, what it can reveal about the time, things that we simply didn't know until we read this book. I do want to say before I turn the program over to our author, we do have copies of the book for sale in our shop, and our shop happens to be open this week. It's open today through Friday, and you can also come into the store and pick up your Passover goodies. So you can buy a copy of the book and you can pick up your Passover goodies. Faris Cassell is a journalist and writer living in Eugene. She earned her bachelor's degree in history from Mount Holyoke College and a master's of science in journalism from the University of Oregon. Her decades of research into Alfred and Hedwig Berger's story was supported by a Mount Holyoke alumni scholarship and by the generous cooperation of the Berger family. Faris, it's a delight to welcome you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to immediately turn the program over to you so you can make some introductory comments. I know you've got some images to show us, and then I have a few questions. I know there'll be questions from the audience. Audience, please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll have time for your questions at the end of the program. Faris, welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you, Judy, and thank you, Amber, behind the scenes for, for keeping us on track. I'm going to screen share, I hope. So tell me, does this come up for you?
It does.
Okay, okay. So thank you all for coming. I'm very honored to be here talking with this group, people dedicated to exploring the world in its many dimensions and through community. I was speaking with a friend lately who had watched a talk that I gave, and she said, "Oh, this was such a wonderful talk. It was serious, but you weren't boring or didactic." I thought, okay, well, there's a bar I'm hoping that I will rise above today also. So this is a dramatic story, the story of Alfred and Hedwig Berger, that grew out of a desperate letter, which Judy has read you parts of. I don't think I need to repeat what she has read to you, except there is the part where she's talking about Alfred Berger, the desperate Jewish Viennese man who wrote this letter. He says that his daughter, his and his wife's daughter, has a way to get to America. His son and their son-in-law has family in America who could provide an affidavit, but only one affidavit would they be able to supply. So Alfred and Hedwig are, quote, seized with fright, thinking of the moment when their children would leave them. They're alone. And so they're begging even strangers, I beg you once more, help us to follow our children. It is our last and only hope. This letter came into my life when my husband brought it home one night from his office. He's a physician, and a patient had brought it to him who said it had been in her family since 1939. They had saved it, and she thought that he would know better than she did what to do with it. So here's a copy of the letter. When I held it in my hands, I was really almost shaking. Even despite the passage of time, which of course was over half a century since the letter had been written, the letter was so direct, so few people had ever even touched it. I could almost feel that my DNA was on this paper now, and so was Alfred Berger's DNA. I felt that I was holding a life in my hands myself. There had been a second page to this letter, which gave the birth date of Alfred and his wife Hedwig, and his occupation, which was a merchantman, and his wife was a housewife, homemaker. And he was 62 when he wrote this letter. She was much younger. She was 50. So I felt not only connected, but I felt just overwhelmed by the questions that seemed to fly out of this letter. I wondered whether the Americans had answered Alfred Berger's letter. I wondered whether Alfred and Hedwig had been able to immigrate. And I wondered, did they survive? One thing that was no question in my mind, my husband is Jewish, I'm Christian, but I knew that if my family, my husband and I and our children had lived in Vienna in those years, we too would be running for our lives. So the mixture of personal association, identification with this letter, and my journalistic curiosity, I thought this would be a wonderful story. My goodness, what I thought I would write a quick story for the newspaper or maybe a magazine, never dreaming that this would take me, would involve me, would hold me so fiercely for a decade. I wanted to know, as I decided to go forward and investigate, who were Alfred and Hedwig Berger, not as victims, but as people, and what had they experienced. I knew I could never answer the question, how did the Holocaust happen? People have been trying since, for the last most of a century to figure that out, and nobody has come close, I think, to answering. But I wanted to try to understand how it happened, on a very granular level, day to day, what was the experience of this one family. I began by interviewing the family who had the descendants of the people who had received the letter, found out that they probably had not responded, and then began to extend my research out. I contacted archives in New York and visited New York several times, and archives wrote back and forth, the internet and phone archives in Vienna. From those places, I learned, I got more information about this family. Here's Alfred Berger, Hedwig Berger. Here is their daughter, Martha, mentioned in the letter, who had a way to escape with her husband, Leo, to America. Here's a second daughter not mentioned in the letter, Gretel. So the story began to expand. I was searching for descendants of the Bergers and found Celia in New York, the granddaughter of Alfred and Hedwig, the daughter of Martha and Leo, who did manage to find ways out of Vienna. Through Celia was really the keystone of my unlocking this story. She was suspicious at first of me and my intrusion into her life, quite naturally and understandably. But once she began to trust me, we became friends over the years. She had me to her house and opened up she had suitcases of documents that she hadn't ever herself explored. So she was really the backbone of the research for this book. Through her, I was able to contact her first cousins, Judith and Micha, in Israel, two of the children of Gretel Berger. We also contacted a first cousin who lived in Massachusetts. This is the grandson of Alfred Berger's brother, Hermann. Hermann was affluent in Vienna, and his wife had relatives with an import company in New York. So they were, that was a wonderful setup for being able to immigrate to America. Hermann Berger brought all of his crates of all of his personal belongings and his family documents that extended back to the 1800s. So we were able to visit this grandson Peter's home in Massachusetts, where he built this room on his house to hold the dining room as it had been in Vienna, and closets and closets of papers. That was when I found my first picture of Alfred Berger. Here he is, standing straight and tall, looking into the future with what looks to me like hope and determination. He's here with his siblings. Here's another picture I came across of Alfred Berger, and I love this one. Here's Hedwig, looking beautiful and sort of like a Mona Lisa. I think her hairstyle is magnificent and would look lovely even today. And Alfred is looking also very, very steadfast, and once again, to me, looking forward with some confidence. I love his great wide wings of his mustache. It's a wonderful picture. You'll notice here, perhaps you can see that he has fairly thick glasses. He had an eye condition that would deteriorate over his life until, by the time he wrote his letter and sent his letter, he was legally blind and carried a white cane. Here's a picture of the Berger family growing up. There's Martha, Alfred, Gretel, and Hedwig walking in the Vienna woods, which is what Jews and non-Jews, all the Viennese people love to do on an afternoon. When I first encountered this letter, I pictured Alfred and Hedwig Berger as alone bearing the brunt of the Nazi occupation. However, I discovered that Alfred and Hedwig were part of a large and very close extended family that got together very often and even took vacations together. Their children slept over at each other's houses. So he had quite a network of support personally. Here's Hedwig. We're guessing, Celia and I have guessed that this picture was taken perhaps around 1928. Here's Alfred over here, Martha, and here is Gretel, next to her first cousin, Ernst. I love these two together. They're the only ones with hats and coats. They look close to and ready for adventure. And in fact, adventure together is what they would experience as the Holocaust approached. This sort of nondescript picture is, and I'm sorry it's blurred, but even my copy of it is quite blurred too. But it is Ernst Berger's military record. As Ernst turned 18 and as all Jews in Vienna recognized the growing Nazi threat, he joined the Austrian army and his unit was sent to the border with Germany to defend Austria. When the Austrian president surrendered the country without any shots being fired, Ernst's unit was withdrawn to Vienna and given a very weird and strange charge. These military people who were going to defend against Hitler were now charged with protecting him as he made his triumphal entry into Vienna. Ernst was stationed in a building overlooking the parade route. As Hitler's car passed in front of them, he had his rifle pointed down at the street, Hitler in his crosshairs. He told his family later that he debated what to do. His officers had left the room as Hitler approached, knowing that Ernst was Jewish. And the theory is that they wanted this Jewish sniper to take care of their problem. They were not yet allied with this Nazi takeover and did not necessarily support it. What a pivot of command that was. Ernst said he almost did pull the trigger, but in the end thought about the horrible repercussions might occur for Jews had a Jewish person assassinated Hitler. Of course, if anyone could have read into the future, that would not have been a concern. This is one of the final pictures that we have of Alfred and Hedwig and their family together before they all began their separate paths, finding their way through the occupation and the Holocaust. You'll notice Alfred's face is quite drawn, and you can see here evidence that his eyes have deteriorated quite a bit if you look at his face. The other family members, Hedwig, Martha, Leo, and Gretel, look as if they're trying very hard to stay something approaching cheerful. This is also probably the last picture taken of any family member in Vienna. These two sisters together on the street next to the Bergers' apartment. Gretel would be the first one to leave, probably within days of this picture being taken. She had been a member of the Jewish youth organization, a Zionist youth group, and would have been a first target of the Nazis. The Jewish Zionist groups managed to organize some escape trips from Vienna. She was on a sealed train. She escaped on a sealed train with several hundred other young people that traveled to Greece. And then in Greece, they were loaded onto a chartered ship, which was actually a Greek pirate ship, and made her, these young people then made their way across a perilous sea. The British airplanes and warships searching for them all the time. The ship anchored offshore, unloaded all of its young people into the ocean where they had to swim ashore. Gretel's shoes tied around her neck so that she wouldn't lose them, and her backpack soaked. She had a small backpack, but she made it to shore safely. Martha had a visa to America. She was not a special target of the Nazis. She would be the next one to leave, but she would not leave till shortly after Alfred wrote his letter to America in the summer of 1939. While Martha was not a special target of the Nazis, the Polish Jews were a focus of Hitler's rage. He really hated the Polish Jews that had come into the Reich, into Germany and Austria. And Leo, this is Leo right here. Leo had crossed the border into what was then the Austrian Empire from Poland as a teenager, and had lived there since. So he was a special target. He was in hiding in Vienna, slept on park benches, and moved around the city quite frequently, trying not to be rounded up. One of his efforts to escape included, because his visa was not yet had not yet risen to the top of the list, so he did have a visa, but he had to wait for his turn to be admitted into America. So he managed to get on a refugee ship, one of a number that were traveling from Europe to Cuba, where Jews would wait for their visa number to be called and they could be admitted to America. So unfortunately for Leo, when his ship arrived in Havana, in the harbor, the bribes that the Jewish organizations paid to the Cuban government were suddenly jacked up through the roof, extortionary, and no Jewish organization could pay for them. So the ships were turned back. Here in the background, you see another ship, which I believe is the SS St. Louis, subject of the movie Voyage of the Damned. It had departed from Hamburg, Germany, and so that's where it was forced to return to. So a number of the Jewish refugees on that ship were actually put in concentration camps and died. Leo's ship had departed from France, so he returned to France, where he was imprisoned as forced labor for the French army. His unit ran towards Dunkirk, hoping to support the British up there, but as the British, of course, were evacuating, his unit turned south and fled in front of the invading Nazis, all the way to south to Marseille. Leo literally ran with the army from the north of France to the south. When he arrived in the south, his visa had already expired, so he had to reapply, get all his papers together and reapply. And he hid in haystacks so that the Vichy government would not imprison him. And then he hid in the Pyrenees for over 2 years. Martha had been able to sail, managed to board the last ship leaving the west of France for America. So she was waiting. The mails were irregular. The possibilities for Leo to arrive were erratic. So she would go down to the New York docks waiting for his ship. The two, they were newlyweds at the time of the Anschluss, the occupation, and she would wait for her husband ship after ship until finally he did make it to America. These are the last pictures that we have of Alfred and Hedwig. Leo painted this picture possibly from the final picture photograph that we saw. But here you can see his face most clearly and how very haggard and worn he looks. Hedwig, this picture certainly was not one of the final, what she looked like at the end of her experience, Holocaust experience. She still has this amazingly wonderful, truly Madonna, like not Madonna, but Mona Lisa expression on her face where you're not sure just what she's thinking and what she's feeling. Alfred and Hedwig did not survive the Holocaust. Each met a separate end at the hands of the Nazis. Alfred in Vienna and Hedwig in Minsk. Here's a picture of Celia and my husband Sidney and myself in Vienna, standing in front of the Bergers' apartment. We traveled to Vienna together, were met by the Israeli cousins of Celia, the Alfred and Hedwig's grandchildren. We walked the streets where Alfred and Hedwig walked. We followed to the different apartments where they had been pushed from one to the next, and finally to their apartment in the Vienna ghetto, a ghetto without walls, but an imprisonment nonetheless. These Berger grandchildren, Celia, Micha, and Judith, these two from Israel, in Vienna, posed where their mothers had posed those many years earlier before they had left. It gave the Bergers to be there to try to understand their family story. It gave them a sense of you might say closure. That's not quite the right word, but it gave them the sense of being able to understand their grandparents, to get to know their grandparents to some small extent. Micha and Judith had known nothing at all about their grandparents. Whenever they tried to ask their mother, Gretel, about how she came to Palestine, now Israel, how she, what the grandparents were like, Gretel would just cry. And so they had learned from an early age not to ask. All of this family was hungry to learn the story. And I think they don't have a sense of closure, but they have a sense of being fulfilled in their family story. The Holocaust, I've come to think, is not at all a story of history. It's not. The questions that it raises are just everywhere. They reverberate with us today. I'd hoped to write a book with some answers. to questions like, what would I have done if I'd have received Alfred Berger's letter? I hoped to approach some of these questions a little bit closer than in fact I have. What would I have done if I'd have lived in Vienna when overnight the Republic disappeared and instead a dictator, and to the maximum degree a dictator, a murderous dictator, came into power? And thinking about receiving the letter, thinking about being a person in Vienna, what would it matter what I said and did? Well, does it matter today what I say and do in this world? Being just an ordinary person, can I affect extraordinary events? These are just a few of the kind of questions that my book raises for me. It is a book of questions, not a book of answers. So I invite all of you here, and I'm so grateful for you being here. I invite you all to ask any questions that the story raises for you, or any questions that you have for me.
Well, thank you. That was really a superb overview. Faris, can you tell us anything? I mean, the letter went to someone named Berger, Clarence Berger, right, in Los Angeles. What do you know about? Can you tell us what you know about that family and
Sure.
what you know about the receipt of the letter? And
Yes, I know quite a bit about that family. The letter actually was addressed to Mrs. Clarence Berger. Her name was Beatrice. She actually had been Canadian, and as a teenager had, with a friend, decided to have an adventure and came to America to work in some of the agricultural factories in around Bakersfield, which is where Clarence lived. It's where he was from, this farming and agricultural community. So that's where they had met. They were married and moved to Los Angeles, where Clarence opened a automobile garage. He serviced cars and trucks. And later, when his business was confiscated during the beginning of the World War, America's entry, he started a welding business and did that for a while, and that too was confiscated and then he got a job repossessing cars from people in the ghetto. He lived in downtown Los Angeles, which is now near where USC is, and where Watts is. So he was then, he was apparently not anti-Semitic, but he was a racist. And as the blacks started to move into downtown Los Angeles, he and Bea moved out. They moved to somewhere north of San Diego.
Wow.
So they were ordinary people, probably of the same socioeconomic level as Alfred and Hedwig, sort of lower middle class.
Well, actually, let's stay on that for a little bit. I think one of the, very, very early on, I think in the first few pages, as you made a decision, you wanted to embark on this research of Alfred and Hedwig, and you called a reporter at the New York Times, if I remember. And the first question you wanted to ask the reporter about his research, and the first thing he kind of preempted you by saying, were they important? Yeah. And I know too that Holocaust scholar Michael Berenbaum wrote about your book. I think you had a conversation about with him. I know he was very complimentary about the book, as he needed to be. He talked about it as a work of power and passion, but he also noted that it was a story of not a story of 6 million anonymous victims, but of one person 6 million times. So why is this story? It's a story about a typical, everyday Austrian family. Why is it important to tell? And I can't even imagine how you would respond when the reporters say, were they important? And then that was the end of the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I was taken by surprise by his question. Um, he meant something different than the words projected, of course. He meant it in a very professional way. Were they celebrities? Were they newsworthy? This was at the beginning of the time when ordinary people were newsworthy, and they make the front pages all the time now of newspapers. But it used to be not so long ago that newspapers were reserved for the leaders of, government officials, so-called important people in our culture, a very top-down look. So when he asked me that question, I just was flustered, and I said, no, they weren't important, answering what he meant. And then when I hung up, of course, and then he said, well, thank you, goodbye. And he ended that conversation very quickly. He was busy. And in fact, today you couldn't possibly be put right straight through to a reporter's desk. It's much more filtered now. But of course, then that question just rankled and made me angry. Really, it was one of the things that kept me going when I wanted to toss this whole book out the window, and things were not opening up for me as I wished. I realized that this was a story of an ordinary person, and who in this world is not an ordinary person is really a very deep belief that I have. We're all ordinary people, no matter what our title, what our backgrounds, we're all important people. So I felt no hesitation about writing the story of one more ordinary person, like all of us.
That's great. I'm so glad you showed us that photograph of the Vienna room. I want to hear a little bit more about it, and um, what it means that it was Alfred's grandson, or Peter is Alfred's grandson, or
Peter is Alfred's brother's grandson.
okay. So, but what it meant for Peter to, I mean,
Yes.
he kept all these materials? He kind of created a shrine. Does he have the self-consciousness and self-awareness to understand what he created with the Vienna room? And um, as the historian and the museum director in me, does he understand that some of that material probably needs to go to USHMM or a repository where it can be cared for?
So there's a lot of questions there all put together, but let me start with the thought that the Holocaust is often described as a wound that has never healed and will never heal. And I think that that's a big part of why Peter saved all these documents, all these pictures so carefully. He did throw away a lot of the papers that his father had brought over, his grandfather had brought over from Vienna. But he built a room onto his house to hold all of these family treasures. I think it's just a story that needs constantly to be honored by the people, especially who are touched by it. So I think he did not feel that it would be that he could not possibly shut the whole thing away and out of sight, out of mind. It had to be accessible. It had to be there as a reminder and as protection of this family story.
Just amazing. So did you know before you got there that you would be invited into a room with these documents?
Well, Peter is just an extraordinary guy. He really is extraordinary in lots of ways. He was a brilliant guy who got accepted to MIT through in the middle of high school. And he knows a lot before you even finish your sentence. So he understood my drive, and he was very open. He invited Celia and me to come and stay with his family. He has a wife and daughter. So we stayed in his house for, let's see, for 3 days, and went through all of his papers as we could. He had boxes and boxes and boxes, and I realized right away that there were more than I would be able to get through easily. So Celia and Peter would go to sleep after we spent a long day in the Vienna room, going through these boxes one piece at a time, hunting for things that mentioned Alfred in particular, that referred to Alfred, because remember, this was his grandfather Herman's collection of papers, not Alfred's, because all of Alfred's family documents, family pictures that didn't get put in Gretel's backpack or the one suitcase that Martha was able to take. All of Alfred's story, was pretty much lost, except for most fortunately the trove of letters that Celia's mother had received from her parents, from Alfred and Hedwig, when she was safely in America, and when they were still able to write her before the mails were censored. And Celia also had this trove of letters between her mother and father as they were each trying to escape separately through France to America. So there were these different troves of letters, and each one was focused in a different direction.
I think part of what made the book so successful and impressive, I mean, it's impressive on many levels, but I really was struck by your writing style, that you're laser focused on storytelling and accuracy, but it's deeply personal. And early on, you're kind of letting your emotions slip in there. So I talk a little bit about your training as a journalist, and what it was like to write such an acutely emotional story. And I'll try not to make this too double-barreled again, but you had to navigate your own place in the story. There was this intersection with your husband and the Holocaust history that affected his family. There was the opposition from your family and from his family, even taking on the subject, not to mention you traveled to Vienna with 7 Berger family members, and you actually describe them as 7 seekers with 7 goals. That's a lot for one writer to absorb. So,
Yeah.
about the process
Sure. I could talk all day about the process because it's a big, sprawling process. But I want to make sure and leave time for questions anyone else may have.
I'm gonna.
So yes, I trained as a journalist, and my focus was what's called creative nonfiction. And the University of Oregon here has just a marvelous program in that. So my feelings about being involved in this story and living with this story in such a deeply personal way just bounced around in every possible way. Sometimes I would sit late at night in my study at my computer, and I would be weeping. And sometimes I would just be typing away and handling pages that talked about which train Hedwig was on, who was on the train. I have lists of all the names and ages of the people who were on her deportation with her. So sometimes I felt cold-hearted, and sometimes I was just melted. And about putting myself in the story, I tried writing it in the beginning without me in it because I felt that I was intrusive. I talked to a number of people about that, including Michael Berenbaum and including the wonderful support group of my writing group. And they all kind of said, it doesn't make all that much sense without you investigating it. You will be the stand-in character for all of us trying to learn this story. And as you come across questions, there will be questions that other people have also.
Oh, I'm really glad you explained it that way. That's beautiful and 100% successful. For anybody who hasn't read the book, they'll see. So thank you for that. Let's turn to a few questions from the chat and see where we do. Let's see. So someone, I think the first question that came in when you were talking about the Greek pirate ship. Do you remember where it dropped off its passengers?
Oh gosh.
It's just curious.
Oh gosh, I'm trying to bring up the name of the place. I can't do that right now, and I'm sorry. It was just on the coastline. There were Betar, the Jewish fighting group and Zionist group. There were members of that group waiting for the ship on the shore, and they had a signal set up where they would flash their flashlights a certain number of times that it was all clear on their side. The British were not patrolling right then, right there. So that I can't say right now exactly where that was. But the Batar was there to meet them, and there were, the Batar were very dashing to people, these young people like Gretel, because some of them were on horseback riding, and pulled up the refugees on the, behind them on the saddle, and others were loaded onto buses and taken into nearby cities where they blended with the citizens, or else where they into refugee camps. And really, when Gretel was taken to a refugee camp, one of the guards who was there was actually a former refugee, now a citizen in Palestine, who became her husband.
Wow.
Yeah.
That happens.
The family joke is he spoke a different language than she did. She only spoke German, but together they understood each other perfectly.
I love it. Someone is asking if you know how and when Gretel went to Israel.
Yes, I do know exactly.
Okay.
She was on the second Betar train to leave Vienna. This was sanctioned by the Nazis. It was June, I'm going to call it June 7th. It was around June 7th. There were a series of trains making an exodus with approved members, young people.
Mm-hmm.
The Nazis were only too happy to get rid of these young people who could have become fighters against the Nazi occupation. And in fact, Alfred Eichmann himself stood at the train and watched Gretel's train depart. The young people lined up in orderly fashion, almost, the Betar trained in almost military fashion in Vienna, just as the Hitler Youth did. So they had drilled with guns, but they of course didn't have weapons with them then. But they lined up in the train station in their rank and file. They went to assigned seats, the older ones taking care of the younger ones. So it was extremely well organized, and it went down to Greece, where then they were loaded on, taken to a deserted beach where this pirate ship, sent small rowboats ashore to pick them up.
Amazing. There is another question about the letter. Why did why did Clarence Berger save the letter?
Such a question. So, so if they didn't answer it, it's so befuddling. Why do you save something that is a reminder of what you did not do, of you're failing as a, as a giving person? He had a church he and B went to. So it's a good question. I think in the end, the family saved it through a couple generations, through several moves, from California to several different places before it ended up with my husband's patient. And I think it's a moving letter. I think everyone who touches it feels that connection to a real human being. It touches your heart. And so I think the answer is it was not only a piece of history, as Sydney's patient said when she gave it to him, but it was a moving, touching piece of history that really has so much that's unanswered about it, so many questions, that it's not a finished document. It's just a what they call a teaser with TV shows. It's something that gives you a hint of a much bigger and much more important story.
Yeah. So your research was extraordinary, and of course, the help of the family members, was
Yes.
enormously beneficial to you. But um, people are very interested in their own family history. I'm sure you get asked this question all the time, but what advice do you give to people embarking on their own family history? Were there archives that you would recommend to someone doing Holocaust history or family history?
Sure. The first thing I'd say, if you have an inkling that you might want to do this, is believe that you can do it, believe that it's worth it and it's important. For many people, there's this kind of wall of not knowing that is often a wall of pain that a person doesn't want to cross through and pass through, to find what horrible things may have happened in the past to their own family. So my first advice is to say, just believe that it's important. This urge that you may have inside of you, listen to it. And there are so many resources available for research. One of the first places I went was the Jewish genealogy group. Was then called Jewish Gen, GEN.
Mm-hmm.
They're a wonderful group. They're in a number of different cities around the country. And they have regular meetings where they discuss problems of research and resources and stories they've learned. They have a small library, or maybe bigger in different places. But the main resource there is the people who are so happy. This is what they love to do. They love to do research. So they were very helpful to me. And the Germans kept enormous vast amounts of records. So those are all there waiting to be used. Even before the Holocaust, Germans just were record keepers. So they continued that process. And Austria, the city of Austria, has terrific records of where every person has lived, what they did for work, and of past generations, even their religion. They don't do that now. When people moved and to where, when they left the country. These are just incredible documents and written in handwriting. So those are so touching to look at the actual handwriting of, say, your grandparents or your great grandparents, whatever. And of course, in Germany now, there's Bad Arolsen, a huge archive of Nazi records that have been gathered together. And I think they've become digitized. I'm not sure, but it's a massive archive. So those are some places to go.
Someone is asking in particular, is there a source where you can find out property where people lived and apartments that were taken by the Nazis?
Sure, you can go to the in Vienna, to the Vienna archives, and you go to their they have now separated their archives into the older and the more modern. So, and you might have to pay a small fee now. It used to be free. That, they have all the records of where everybody lived and where they moved. And they also may have the death records of people. So they have enormous records in the different cities in Germany, in Bad Arolsen, which is a national archive, and tremendous number of records available because the Germans kept records of everything.
And some of those are, or maybe they're just duplicates, are in like the Jewish Museum Berlin also has
Sure.
similar records, and I bet the Jewish Museum Vienna probably does too. Yeah.
Yes.
Good. So someone is asking, the Bergers, we're calling them everyday, ordinary, typical, which is probably unfair since everybody is unique. But someone's just asking, is it possible they just didn't know where to turn to for help?
No.
Yeah.
Oh no, oh no. I mean, I should have said this during the talk. They tried everything they could. They were very disadvantaged in their escape efforts by being elderly, by Alfred's physical impairment with his vision, because America did not want to take people with any physical impairments at that time. And they tried to sneak across the border to Belgium when Jews were doing that. I mean, here they are. I mean, he was 60, 62, and then older, trying to sneak across the Belgian border. They were turned away by the Germans, and luckily not put in jail, probably because Alfred had developed this very wonderful strategy of using his blindness when it was useful to him. And so being a handicapped person actually probably saved them in that border escape attempt, and also probably allowed them to stay in their own apartment for as long as they did, because he was classed as having a handicap. And who can even imagine why the Germans cared? I mean, they were doing horrible things to people, and they allowed a handicapped person to stay put longer, although they moved, a number of Jewish people moved in with Alfred and Hedwig as they were pushed out of their, other people were pushed out of their apartments.
Mm-hmm. There's been a couple of questions about the letter. The letter was written, Alfred wrote that letter in English, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there was no issue that the Berger family in LA could read it. It was in
No, and in fact, I mean, here is a copy of the letter. It's written on thin airmail paper. This is, of course, a color Xerox is all it is, and it may well have been written not by him personally, but he may have gone to the Jewish Community Organization in Vienna, and they may have helped him to do that. Mm-hmm. I don't know that Alfred and Hedwig owned a typewriter. And I do know that Alfred and Hedwig did not speak English at that point.
Oh, interesting.
They studied English as it came closer and closer to the time when they hoped to immigrate to America. But at that time, they didn't. And the addresses this is not, Alfred Berger did not send one letter. He sent a number of them to people with the same last name. The addresses Bergers in America may well have come from the telephone books that the main post office, main Vienna post office, kept for people to use. They had a set of phone books from the major cities all over the world.
Wow.
Yeah, Vienna was a world capital. It is just astonishing how such a barbaric thing could erupt in a civilized, whatever that means, were educated world capital. People were getting Nobel Prizes for their work in scientists and writers, and people were where you think that this was a culture that couldn't stand for what happened.
And it's the question we deal with every day at the museum. And what you said at the beginning is exactly what our education Amanda Coven tells students. You're going to, you'll leave with more questions than you have. Just cannot solve this.
Well, I hope so, because I think, Socrates knew best. Questions was the best way to try to get closer to the truth.
Exactly. Faris, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Our time is up. I see another question about where the book can be purchased. We do have copies at the museum shop. We're located at 724 Northwest Davis in downtown Portland. The store is actually open this week only for Passover from 11 to 3 p.m. Open right now. So if you want a copy of the book, I urge you to scoot down to the museum.
Well, I hope you all will go to the museum. It's also, if it's totally impossible to get to the museum, it's available online at Amazon and local bookstores, Barnes and Noble. It's available a lot of places, and it will be coming out in paperback in June. At which point Costco will have it. It was Costco got especially interested in when recently the book won the 2020 National Jewish Book Award. So thank you all for coming to listen, and I really appreciate your questions also.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Look forward to seeing you again. Faris, what a delight. Really. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye. I wish we could have been there in person.
Next year.
Next year.
Bye-bye.
Bye.